Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Daniela Bleichmer. I am the director of the Levan Institute for the Humanities at USC, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the first event in our On Writing series, a series that is organized by David Yulin and Emily Anderson. And we had a series of wonderful events last year. They are all archived and available on our website. And we are delighted for the first event of this year's series. Emily Anderson, unfortunately, has an emergency and cannot join us today, but I will pass the microphone to David Yulin, who will be hosting and moderating today's event.
Thanks, Daniela. Welcome to everyone. Thank you for being here on a busy Tuesday morning. This, as Daniela said, is the first in this year's series, Levan Institute series on writing. We inaugurated the series last year with a series of events, similar kind of panel discussions about sort of how the academy can meet the vernacular or the community in a certain sense. And thinking about different aspects of writing and publishing. What we're going to do today is we have a really superior panel. I'm really happy to have all of these people have agreed to come and talk to us. And we're going to talk about book reviewing. We'll talk about it through the lens. I suspect there'll be some through the lens of the academy, but really also kind of the art of the book review, the idea, as I've long felt that book reviews, in order to be successful, have to function in some way as kind of essays in their own right. There is obviously or can be a service component to book reviewing, but there is also an aesthetic and critical component to book reviewing as part of an ongoing conversation between writer and reviewer and reader, a kind of culture of literary discussion. I love the fact that it takes place in the public square can take place in the public square in the most sort of, most obvious ways possible, in terms of newspaper and websites and mainstream or mass media. So we'll talk about the aesthetics, we'll talk about the practicalities. What we're going to do is each of the panelists, I'll introduce them in a moment, and then we're going to go through. They're each going to talk for about 5 to 7 minutes about their own practice and their own ideas, and then I'll come back in. I'll have a few questions basically for the panel. We will open it up to questions from all of you fairly early. We are a small enough group at the moment that you will need to use your little digital fake hand icon to raise your hand, because we're at more than one screen, so I won't see you if you're not on the screen that I'm on. But you can also put questions into the chat, although we would love to have your voice and face. And if you are able to, particularly during the conversation part, or willing to, I should say, to turn on your camera, that makes, it makes for a more human interface to the two-dimensional format of the glass screen. So let me quickly introduce our panelists, and then we will get started on the conversation. And so we have today with us Colin Burrow, who is a professor of English and comparative literature and a senior research fellow at All Souls College and a contributor to the London Review of Books. Anita Felicelli, who is an author and a contributor to the Los Angeles Review of Books, also has just become the California Book Club editor at Alta Journal. Boris Kochka, who is the books editor at the Los Angeles Times. My colleague Dancy Senna, an associate professor of English at the University of Southern California, and James Ye, who is the reviews editor of The Believer. And so, as Boris asked right before we started, we're going to go alphabetical by last name. Always a burden for me when I was young, given where my last name fits in the alphabet. And so, Colin, let's start with you, and then we'll kind of move through. I also want to suggest for those who aren't that you use speaker view, so you can see everybody who's speaking in the biggest, most visible possible way. Although I don't want to dictate how anyone uses Zoom. So we'll start with Colin.
Thanks very much indeed, David. It's a particular pleasure, I must say, to be in California virtually at the moment, because actually I'm in Oxford. It's 7 o'clock in the evening. It's pouring as rain. I've got 2 dogs that I'm dog sitting who'll probably bark in the background. So, it's really nice to be somewhere sunny and warm and in the morning. as David said, write quite often for the London Review of Books, who do very long reviews, sort of up to 5,000 words. And I really got into doing it by accident because I had an MPhil student who decided that rather than go on to do a PhD, he would get a job at the London Review of Books. And he said, you know, why don't you review this anthology of 17th century poetry, which is sort of partly what I do. And I said yes, and this piece appeared, and it had a good title. It was then place my parboiled head upon a stake, and I sort of took the torture from there. And I've written, I think 70 something pieces for them over the years, and given that they're all sort of around 3,000 words, I could have written 3 boring academic books instead, and I'm really pleased I haven't. It's actually, I mean, if I'm honest about it, it's the one bit of my academic work that I unequivocally enjoy without reservation. You know, when I'm editing texts, as I have done quite a bit, you know, there's a sort of, oh no, not another textual variant feeling. When I'm writing books, there's that awful, oh no, how am I going to finish this darn thing kind of feeling. And when I'm writing articles, which are usually commissioned, I have that terrible feeling of, you know, how do I get everything I know about illusion in the 16th century into a 7,000 word essay? And that sort of pain is absent when I write for the LRB, because I can just say what I think and write actually to the length I want to. They're very flexible about that. And I always used to have as my ideal audience my uncle, who was an uncle by marriage, who was a primary school teacher who was interested in absolutely everything. And I would think, you know, how would this sound to Michael? And I think the most proud moment in my entire academic career actually was when I'd done a piece in the London Review of Books, a review of a book about the history of swearing. And I got this postcard from Michael, who didn't know that he was my ideal audience, which simply said, absolutely effing brilliant. And I thought, I've arrived, you know, this is, I have hit my target audience dead on. And he's, although he died a few years ago, I'm still really writing for him, that kind of intelligent, articulate, well, in his case, distinctly left-wing and cultured audience. And it's great to be able to imagine that sort of readership, and actually in the case of the LRB to have it, because it has a circulation of about 80,000 people. It intersects with my more boring academic work in all sorts of ways. The main thing I'm really grateful for is actually the team at the London Review of Books are incredibly good at anticipating what I might be interested in, even when I wouldn't have thought for a moment I would be interested in it. So a few years ago, they said, would I like to review a book by, or a new book about the English experimental novelist B.S. Johnson? And I'd never read a word of B.S. Johnson. And I said, yeah, actually. So I read B.S. Johnson. That was fun, and wrote a piece about him. And one of the things B.S. Johnson did was experiment with typography. And one of the things I did in my review of him was to have a little cutout section where I said, you know, you can cut out this bit, see what the words are behind it. And the LRB went to the lengths of designing a little scissors icon around a box that they could print on the page, so that readers could get that B.S. Johnson sense of a postmodern experience of text dissolving before their eyes. And that was great. And more recently, they asked me to do a piece about Ursula Le Guin, because they do these sort of long-term, backward-looking pieces. And they asked me that because my mother was a young adult fantasy writer called Diana Wynne Jones, who had a lot in common with Ursula Le Guin. And again, I would never have done that in the normal course of events. And I was a great admirer of Ursula Le Guin already, and I read most of her work for the piece. And it was sort of eye-opening, really, to see her entire career and try and write in 5,000 words for a general audience what I found there. The other thing, sort of illicit pleasure, I suppose, of reviewing in the way I do it is it does allow for a little bit of revenge every now and then. I have done that extremely rarely, but I do confess that I have done it. My very first book was reviewed by a very distinguished Renaissance scholar called Alistair Fowler. And his review basically began, why on earth do we need another book about the epic tradition? It's all been done. And it was a model of how not to review a book by a person early in their career. It was absolutely gut-wrenching for me. 20 years later, I was asked if I would review Alistair Fowler's book about names. And so a little glint came into my eye and I thought, yeah, I'll do that. And it's a very good book. And I said it was a very good book and a very wonderful book. It's got some slightly mad stuff in it about anagrams of names. And I spent longer than I care to reveal producing anagrams of Alistair Fowler's full name, which is Alistair David Shaw Fowler. And I came up eventually with the perfect anagram for somebody who does vicious book reviews, which was, has a flaw, vitriols awarded. And that not only made me laugh and gave me a private pleasure, but made quite a lot of people who've been reviewed by Alistair Fowler also laugh and gave them pleasure. But the key reason why I do it is because because of its the cultural value of the reviewing process. I think academics, particularly in my discipline, tend to get locked into their own discourses. They tend to argue too much with each other, and they tend not to lift their heads up and look at the world around them enough. And I think they don't talk directly enough often. I think literary criticism, has at its heart making judgments and justifying them and explaining them to people, and then, reasonably disagreeing over judgments. Very often that's just what happened. And I think one thing that long form reviewing in particular enables you to do is to show the importance of that skill. And at the moment, obviously, public discourse is not in a very healthy state. Being short and abusive carries a premium. And I think that does mean that, those extraordinary journals, the London Review of Books and the New York Review of Books and others as well, that are really maintaining sustained serious reviewing, are doing a really important piece of cultural work, because they're saying, look, it matters to be able to explain your point of view and justify your judgments. And it matters that academics should be able to speak to a much wider group of people. So that's what I do, and that is why I do it. Thanks.
Thanks, Colin. That the Fowler anecdote reminds me of, I was once on a panel about the ethics of book reviewing, and one of the panelists, this was a long time ago, was Christopher Hitchens, who told a very similar story about being asked to review a book. He got called by an editor. He said, I don't have time. And then they named the author of the book, and it was someone who had trashed his first book. And he said, oh, I think I can make the time. But then he actually thought the book was quite brilliant. And he ended up having to write a review that suggested that. And then he said to the panel, that's ethics in book review. So, all right. Our next panelist is Anita Felicelli. Anita?
Thank you, David. I'm glad to be here. That was really great, Colin. I actually have never written a book review on someone's book where I knew the author. I just categorically refuse, or where they've reviewed me, because I need to maintain that separation. And I'm a little bit too empathetic to authors I know. And so I tend not to ever write, anything about them. And that actually tends to upset authors, because I think they're befriending me in order to get the review. And I think that's a really good point about being able to explain your judgments and book reviews as cultural production. I usually review for Los Angeles Review of Books and San Francisco Chronicle. I have also reviewed for various blogs early on, maybe 10 years ago, like Pop Matters and The Rumpus, and that was mostly just to get my foot in the door. I have started reviewing more for other newspapers, the Washington Post, and I think each of those publications has a different audience. My favorite is actually Los Angeles Review of Books, because I tend to like an academic lens, but even when I write there, I tend to try to engage with lay readers who don't have, specialized knowledge of literature. I want to reach, the plumbers, the lawyers, the insurance salesperson, the stay-at-home dad, the CEO. I think that's how books live in the world, and what makes, reviewing for a broad audience really wonderful. I think a review can build in ideas generated in the academy and still reach everyone. You have to kind of figure out, there's a little bit of an art to trying to include that exposition when you're using, technical terms, or where you're using a technical idea that was developed in academia, but trying to go off on your own with it, with a new work. With an academic journal, I think you can go deep into a topic, assuming that readers will follow, because they start with a somewhat similar body of knowledge and they build off of the same or similar premises. But there's a special thrill to me of trying to reach that person who wasn't an English major, and like a book club person, or basically anybody. I want it to reach the broadest group of people, but still include knowledge and close reading, and to carefully fit the text. I tend to pitch to the same editors and publications repeatedly, because I know what their taste is over time and what books they're likely to assign. I think there's so much less space given to book reviews in newspapers, so I don't find it useful to repeatedly pitch different editors who are looking for different things in the hopes that I'll get someone to bite. So I will only pitch when I think a book is exciting, whether that's good or bad, or whatever the reason is. I have to be a little bit passionate about it to ask an editor to let me write about it. Some of the editors that I regularly write for will solicit me to write a review. I think over time, like over 10 years or whatever, they have a good sense of the subject matter that interests me. And so whether I like the book or not, it's a good fit usually for what I want to spend my time reading and thinking about. And even if it's not, I'm really concerned with fairness. I think, first and foremost, a successful book review will take a book on its own terms. I don't think the author's intention is the last word in interpreting a book, but it should factor into a critical analysis as well as the critic's feel for the text. I think, you get a lot of crazy things on Goodreads that are just, I like this character, I don't like this character, oh, I don't, it's just quirks. And for me, that's not an interesting book review that I would want to read. I think the successful reviews are conscious of what the author is doing in a book, and then they evaluate that intention alongside a larger project of literature in the broad sense, and then also that author's tradition, whether the tradition is the Harlem Renaissance or it's a subcultural movement in India, whatever it is. A good review, from my perspective, will factor in where the book sits, the context for the book. And at the same time, I think criticism, as David mentioned, is its own art. Fiction is an act of imagination. Poetry relies a lot on white space and absence and silence. Reviews, I think, need to be intensely focused on the text of the book, or that's the kind of review I like reading anyway. And it should seek out a way of describing the book that doesn't just reiterate the blurb, because that's sales purposes, but also engage with readers on its own terms and accurately convey the substance of the book. I think it's, for me, it's a little disturbing when a piece of criticism doesn't bear a strong enough relationship to the words on the page, or it's built around facts and suppressed premises that are demonstrably false. I think that happens most in the context of writing that includes sort of non-mainstream ideas or cultural material with which a reviewer isn't familiar. So I think that's where you have to be really thoughtful as a reviewer to try and work that information in, and to do your homework and to do extra reading when necessary. Because ultimately, even if you don't like a book, for me, it's a good idea to make sure that the reader who is familiar with that cultural material is able to read between the lines to figure out whether or not, this is a book to give a chance to or not. So it is its own art, but I think it really has to build off of intention and tradition. And I think it also needs to accurately describe the book. Like, it really needs to suit the book, even when you don't like it. And I think coming back to the words over and over again and sort of seeing what is the author's intention? Is that intention, how does that intention fit in the world at large? How does it fit into literature is sort of what I'm looking for in a book review, and it's what I tried to do. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Anita. Our next panelist is Boris Kochka from the Los Angeles Times. And Boris, welcome.
Thanks, and thank you, David, and the Institute for giving me this recruiting opportunity. Because I use freelancers almost exclusively for reviews, and I really like what Colin and Anita both said. So give me a ring. I came to the book review. I shouldn't say the book review. I came to the job of books editor from mostly a background of writing, and what I was mostly writing was not reviews but journalism, and covering cultural institutions, doing long-form profiles of writers, examining their legacies with sort of a critical lens, but mainly as journalism. Toni Morrison, Joan Didion, people like that. And so when I came here to be the books editor, that I guess I'm sort of apologizing in advance from my perspective, which is that I think what makes reviews effective, especially for a newspaper and for our needs, is when the critic recognizes that it's not distinct from journalism. And what I mean is that, there are certain elements that I think are important to keep in mind, especially when you're writing reviews at shorter length. And that is the challenge that mainly I have to deal with. And, for one thing, presenting things clearly in the right order, making sure that the reader understands what's going on. Also giving a true sense of what the book is like, much as what Anita was saying. Sometimes I will read a review and through the fog of the critic, I just won't. I want to understand what it's like to read the book, good or bad, positive, negative, and of course. This isn't going to be news to anyone, but I think the most engaging reviews bring in the wider world. And I think the recent N+1 essay made a big deal out of how editors are looking for trend pieces, which they gave a fancy new name. But yes, of course. So essays that bring in multiple books, talk about things such as the female passive narrator, or why noir as a form is particularly suited to depicting the Troubles in Belfast. Those are ideas that are sticky and that I like. And the other sort of journalistic thing to keep in mind is my boss here, Julia Turner, always says, "What's the headline?" Before you even assign the piece, which can sound commercial or crass, but it's a fact. If you can't, as while you're pitching a review, think about what the headline would be or what the top line is, then it's a little less promising, especially when and this is the thing, my job is to make sure that I'm responsibly covering the ground of the literary world and engaging in the conversation that's going on, while at the same time not spending too much freelance money, not spending it on reviews that aren't getting engagement. I mean, this is things that are talked about all the time internally. And so it's a hard balance to pull off, but I think that the way to pull it off is that when a book is not going to be known to a reader, to really make a case for why it should be, even if it's a negative review, why it's important, why what you're writing is important. And beyond that, I always look for a point of view as distinct from a style necessarily, because I think especially when you're writing short, it's easy to fall on crutches and to establish certain tics. And we've seen it everywhere. We've seen it from critics at the New York Times, and it's just, I think your style should be, your approach should be different for every book that you write about. And I think that's important to keep in mind, and that keeps the work engaging, while at the same time having a point of view, having something to say, not falling into plot summary, not, like I'm not just going to list pet peeves, but the last thing I'll say about it is when someone says readers, a certain kind of reader will like this about it, a certain kind of reader will like that, which sounds a little like a consumer report, but is also like presuming a lot about your audience. And I think as a critic, you should probably have the same mindset as an author would, which is that you are writing for readers, but you are not presuming that you know them and writing toward them in some sort of way, because otherwise, you could just do a top 10 list or something like that, which we also do. But reviews have their own function and should succeed on their own terms. I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say. I'm just looking forward to getting into potential specifics as we get through questions.
Great, thank you, Boris. Our next panelist is Dancy Senna. Dancy.
Hi, and I'm happy to be here. I feel like, I'm not sort of probably as much of a reviewer. I really am an occasional book reviewer, and I think I mostly consider myself a novelist. And when I take time out to write reviews, I really enjoy them, partly because I can actually finish them, which is different from writing novels. There's like a sense of completion, but also to engage in work that I feel really strongly about. And I tend to say no to more books that come onto my desk for possible reviews than I do yes, because I guess going back to that idea of having a strong feeling about a book and feeling that it kind of connects to something else I've been thinking about, and is a way for me to explore larger interests in the world. So the book becomes just a vehicle for me to write an essay about something I've been thinking about, but going deep into the text and seeing the text as somehow like symptomatic or evidence of something larger. And so that's one kind of review. And I just, wrote about the sort of spate of anti-racism self-help books for The Atlantic. And I had been thinking about that for a long time, and the kind of culture of like white progressivism at this moment. And two books came onto my desk that spoke to that. So I was excited to think about it with those two books. And the other kind of review that isn't really a review that I like to do are books about dead authors who have not gotten a lot of attention. And I think we talk a lot about like, censorship at the moment and like suppressing certain artworks, but one of the main ways to suppress an artwork is not to talk about it or write about it or think about it. And I think about this in particular, or my particular interest in African-American literature, and which authors were not canonized, were not even spoken about. Their work just kind of disappeared. And I like to kind of resurrect those writers and look at like what was challenging or seemingly illegible about them to the larger culture at the time. And I wrote, about Fran Ross in the New Yorker, who wrote a satirical novel, A Black Woman in the 70s, like a Black feminist satire that disappeared, and she had no kind of life as a writer. No, it didn't resonate in the culture at the moment, and she was writing really ahead of herself. George Skyler from the Harlem Renaissance, who wrote, kind of like Afrofuturism before its time, and that was a long essay kind of review. And Nella Larson, I was thinking those were three writers who really kind of faded into obscurity, and that as a kind of subject interests me. And so whenever I get an opportunity to write about that, I feel like it's doing some larger cultural work of bringing attention to really ignored voices. And I think, the only other thing I'll add, because everyone has said so many great things, and things that I've been jotting down as they've been talking, but is that, I tend to write book review mingling it with autobiography, for better or worse. I tend to bring myself into the review and ground, what I'm saying about the work from my own vantage point, and I think that comes out of being a storyteller and being a novelist, is that I'm really interested in telling a story of what it was to read this work, and how it kind of touched me on multiple levels, both like intellectually and personally. So with the Atlantic review about the anti-racism books, I was writing about, putting my son in a progressive school and then pulling him out. And I kind of talked about it within the context of like being ensconced in a kind of like racial redemption amongst white people and running for the hills. And with like Nella Larson or George Skyler, kind of talking about their influence on me as a writer and how they freed me as a writer. So those aren't maybe traditional reviews. I'm not even sure if they count as reviews, but they're me thinking about books in a kind of public space.
Great, thank you, Danzy. I'm really interested in that question of, which I'm hoping we'll talk a bit about kind of the I guess the continuum of the review, the sort of the short review into the review essay, because I think there's a relationship there, but each of them has its own kind of requirements, and there's something really fascinating about having that kind of breadth of space to work in along review essay. All right, our final finalist is James. Do you want to, James, are you ready to jump in?
Yeah, thanks so much, David, and yeah, thanks to the Institute and the other panelists. It's really, and thanks for everyone being here, taking the time to be here digitally, virtually, however you want to put it. So I guess I wanted to respond a little bit to what some of the other panelists have said. I mean, something I think very interesting. So I would just say this, right? I think I operate in a kind of position that's a bit of a cross between Danzy's and Boris's, in that I currently work as the reviews editor at The Believer magazine. But I don't tend to write straight up reviews, and usually what I do, but some of the pieces that I've written, will be about maybe a pop culture phenomenon or a author interview, but that also is using a lens of, lens of literature, the lens that's informed by literature, that's informed by review forms and forms of just like analysis and critique. That's not only just a celebrity service review interview or something like that. But I do want to say that the largest venue I've ever been asked to do a review for, and this hits on what Colin was bringing up, the sort of weird, the sort of revenge thing. And you too, David, and I think had mentioned, but so this, but and this also is the autobiography thing. Anyway, what I was going to say was there. So I was out once in New York. I live in New York, and I had met somebody, and it was a friend of a friend, and this person did something very, I thought, remarkable. As someone who has an Asian background and an Asian face, which I'm reminded of actually with a lot of frequency lately, even in New York, questions about where I'm from and all that, right? And that's a big part of a certain strain of discourse recently and ongoing. Anyway, somebody had the distinction of mistaking me for a different Asian person twice, which had never happened before. Once in person and the other time in over email too. And it was really fascinating to me, and it left, it wasn't something I sought out, but it was something that happened to me and I remembered. And then I got asked to do like a year later, a review of this person's book. And that was an interesting quandary for me because I remembered that, but it was also for a newspaper. So it's not necessary, and it's a squib, essentially, you know, a couple hundred words. So it's not like, and also, is it appropriate to bring this in? There's all these questions, right? And sort of as a younger reviewer, I think at the time, and I guess I still like to consider myself on the younger spectrum or whatever, but it was like, I didn't ask for any of this. And yet now this could be a potential thing to, you know, an obstacle to my advancement as a journalist, as a writer, and just some, you know, sort of pocket change or whatever. And so I asked the editor, yeah, and the editor had asked if I had any conflicts. So I said, I asked her what exactly that might mean. And hers was basically, her response was essentially, would it interfere with your sort of ability to fairly, critically evaluate the text or whatever? And I thought that it wouldn't. You know, she asked it, I was disclosed that I had met him a few years before. But I didn't disclose, I suppose, that it was like a strange interaction or a memorable interaction. It was an interaction. Anyway, I got the book and it was pretty good. I liked it. I had a few quibbles, but ultimately, you know, I published it, or I wrote it, and it was published. And then the sort of coda is that the writer actually wrote me back, because we had been in touch over email where he had mistaken me before, and he had a memorable reply, though in over the years I've since forgotten the reply, but it was essentially like, it was essentially, you know, we meet again kind of. And it, you know, and actually I should just pull it up maybe and bring it and produce it, but you know, this just made me think of that. And you know, I think reviewing is a funny thing, because there are all these potential pitfalls and conflicts, and you know, I think we have to turn to some kind of compass of our own to try to sort of navigate the ethics of that. But you know, and I suppose, you know, there's like the very traditional ones, but there's also, I think, new and flexible ones that are emerging, and maybe I'll get to that at the end of this moment. Anyway, just a little bit about what I do at The Believer. So, and my own background. So The Believer magazine, probably a lot of you are familiar with it, but it was started in 2003. And it operates in an interesting position that it's, right, it's not like a newspaper like the LA Times or the New York Times, or a large public circulation literary sort of or culture mag like the New Yorker or the Atlantic, LRB. But, you know, we sort of operate, we have, it was started, you know, in response to what, you know, Heidi Julavits in 2003 described as a kind of snark, a sort of you know, ocean of negative reviewing that was mean-spirited and just sort of about points gathering or such, and you know, by sort of cranks, and you know, she sort of advocated for something that was, you know, not uncritical, but you know, essentially spending time with things you actually like and care about and give a shit about, and giving, you know, the limited space in a sort of small publication, a little mag, to you know, celebrating those works, and also the service of providing those works to a larger audience. And you know, so I think what you know, and that was in 2003. Now we're 2021. What has, I think, you know, some of that has, what has stayed the same, you know, like the magazine is no longer based sort of a McSweeney's house scrappy organization, but is now, funded by like a nonprofit, the Black Mountain Institute at UNLV. So it's like San Francisco for Las Vegas. So there's a change there, obviously. But, one of the things that I think has stayed the same is this desire to kind of operate that's a little bit outside the sort of news cycle and the sort of churn, and to sort of seek out works that aren't being spotlighted or talked about as much. That's something the magazine also does with the Believer Book Award. And yeah, so like that's kind of, I think, what I see the role of the Believer is kind of operating in this space that's not, the sort of maybe a liminal space, kind of picking up things that fall through the cracks. And, I think that as an editor, as a reviews editor, I was a features editor before that. But, when some of the things come to mind, for my mind, in terms of what I commission, what I like to commission, these are pieces. I think the role of an editor is a really interesting one. And it's a lot of responsibility. You pick what gets talked about, who's going to talk about it, and how it gets talked about. And so, I think there's a lot of responsibility, and something I personally find myself drawn to pieces that do have what, Dansy's talked about, not only exclusively, but I do, a piece that has some personal element can be quite appealing to me. And then to that extent, like, I guess more broadly, I'm interested in works, and these are the kind of works that I like to read too, are works that just couldn't only have been produced by the writer themselves. Like it couldn't, and because of who they are, what their perspective is, maybe their, life experience, their background, where that kind of thing, and engaging with it in an interesting way. Those are, I think, what makes a successful piece in general, but also a review. I guess also the final thing, or a thing I think about, maybe two last things, but I think of the review as kind of a guide. I think, you're there to sort of help show, ideally it's a guide that's sort of, I think, presented by a fellow traveler that is also, that has like, shows what's what, what sort of not to miss, what to check out, and then also what to avoid, and maybe a little bit of what's unavoidable. And I think that is, that's an important role. And maybe I'll leave it at that and hear what everyone else has to say. So.
All right. Thanks to all of you for these statements. This is really interesting. I also have been taking notes the whole time, and now I'm going to try and make some sense of these notes to make some questions. But I want to start by picking up on some of the stuff James was just talking about, particularly that notion of what to avoid. I think, the Heidi Julavits anti-snark manifesto was widely sort of regarded, or in certain quarters regarded, and even, let's say, derided as a kind of no negative reviews policy. There was a big discussion about that in 2003. And yet, James, you're talking about how the reviewer's responsibility, which I strongly agree with, is not just to tell you what to read, but also, if that is the judgment, right, what to avoid. My own preference is to, if I have to write a negative review, or if I'm reading a negative review, is to read a negative review that's sort of, not a hit piece, but a piece where the writer was, to use a phrase I think Anita was talking about, the writer was enthusiastic about the book and wanted to engage with the book, and then is kind of disappointed, or let's say the criticism is growing out of the failure for that enthusiasm to pan out. So I want to just throw a general question out to start, and then we'll get questions from the audience as well. And in fact, if you have a question while we're talking, just raise your hand virtually, and I can see you in the participants queue, and I'll call on you and bring you into the conversation. But this is a question for all of you, both from the point of view of editors, those of you who are editing, and also from the point of view of writers. What do you do about negative reviews? What's your, I'm not necessarily as a policy, but you sign on to review a book. Often you haven't read the book before you sign on to review. There are all sorts of reasons you say yes, because you're interested in the material, you are interested in the writer or their career, or whatever it is. And then you're in the middle of that book, and you're realizing that you have a number of reservations or criticisms about the book. How do how do we handle that question? Because I think it's a really important question. I think that robust critical conversation requires reviewers to write negative reviews if that is organically what they think, and it requires publications to publish those reviews. Let's talk generally from both, from both your experience as writers and also from your experience as editors. Those of you who edit, what's your take on the negative review?
Can I just jump in for a sec? I had a funny conversation with a critic who wrote a piece about a book, and I just had the sneaking suspicion that they were pulling their punches. And so like the third or fourth email in, I was like, does this book suck? And they were like, well, yes and no, and actually sort of got them to articulate further what their reservations were. And I just think I hear a lot about negative reviews, and I have a problem with them. I think when they become, again, a habit of criticism, a certain type of book gets dismissed, and there are ways that a critic can quote out of context or just sort of put their foot on the scale to in books that I've read, and I know that there's a more balanced perspective on that. I don't like that, but I think if a book is bad or a disappointment and especially if it's by a prominent writer that a lot of people are looking forward to reading, I think it's important to say that. I think it's often important for the writer themselves, if they are of strong enough constitution, to take that criticism to heart if it matters to them. So that's just my piece on it. I'm not anti-negative review at all.
I keep forgetting to unmute myself. Thanks, Boris. From the point of view of some of the writers, I don't want to call anyone particularly, but what do you anyone else on the panel want to jump in on this question of sort of I don't want to say I don't know what I don't want to say the ethics of the negative review, but Dancy.
I mean, one thing I've done this once when I was in my 20s and sort of regretted it, was to take a book, read it, and dislike it, and then have to write the review, even though I didn't really want to. And so I think I try to know a bit more about the book before I agree to review it, because one thing I don't want to do is punch down. I don't want to just take out like a young writer who's just written their debut, and it might not be perfect, but then why am I paying attention to it in a negative way? So I feel like with like debut writers, first-time novelists, unknown writers, like I really can't see any point in taking something that's so hard anyway and just then like, tearing it apart. But some of my favorite reviews to read have been very snarky, and there's a whole art to the snarky review that I can like remember reading some reviews that were like really snarky about writers who were really huge, and when done well, they're like really brilliant and like remind me of why I was irritated by this book and kind of help me find a language for why this book bothered me. So I don't feel like, I don't tend to really write negative reviews of other fiction writers, but I do write negative reviews if it feels like it's part of a like phenomenon that needs to be talked about.
Yeah, I agree with you totally about the not punching down. And I think it's actually a really important ethical question. There are different criteria that apply to writers at different stages of their careers. If, as you say, if it's a debut book and you're going to essentially like smother the baby in its crib, then that's, that's not, I'm not interested in that as a human or as a reviewer. But if there's something interesting to say about a book or a phenomenon or some way of kind of getting inside a discussion, I think I agree with you. I've read certain reviews that have really catalyzed my own thinking about a book in a certain way, a book that I wasn't able to quite articulate what I thought. And then I've read that review, both positive and negative, where they've really clarified things for me. And I think that can be quite useful.
I was thinking of Colson Whitehead wrote a really negative review of Richard Ford a long time ago. I feel like it led to like Richard Ford at a party spitting at Colson Whitehead.
He did, that was actually the review I was thinking about exactly. Because
like that was such a fun review to read. And then like during COVID, I was like, God, I miss like literary dramas like that. Like nobody was at a party sort of screaming at anyone. So
yeah, that review, because I reviewed that book, and also I didn't like it very much, but I think my review sucked, I have to say. And when I read Colson's review, I was like, oh, this is the review. I wish I'd written this review, because he nailed exactly what I had, my issues with that book. And then yes, then it became an unfortunate series of incidents afterwards. We have a question from MG Lord, and so MG, just unmute yourself and jump in.
Well, I was actually wondering, I suppose this is for James and Boris, how important are those advanced review things like Kirkus and Publishers Weekly in terms of you're making a decision about what book you will assign?
It matters.
I've seen hatchet pieces in Kirkus which seem upsetting.
I think you look for, I wouldn't go by just one piece. I think it's a good thing we have, several of those. It serves a useful function. I mean, you want something other than marketing and name recognition. And preferably you've read it, or you've heard from a critic who is interested in it. And that, to me, would, in most circumstances, outweigh those advanced reviews. So,
and just to piggyback on what Boris just said, I agree. It's they serve a function. I think something that would be helpful, and I like that Boris mentioned the thing about blurbs, because if you're, for instance, it sounds like you're kind of in the consideration of pitching and sort of seeing what might be, how to do that. Like, I think it's, if let's say Kirkus slammed a book, but you actually think it's great, and you've read it, and you can, or you see how they, Publishers Weekly misses the point on why it's something so great, like that's actually ammunition, I think, to put together a more compelling review, that you're sort of, hey, this is unfairly sort of being maligned, or something's being missed. So I think you can use that to its advantage too, your advantage.
Thanks, Colin. I didn't see before, but you wanted to jump in, I think, on the prior. I'm going to just piggyback back. I didn't see you before. I think you wanted to jump in on the prior question. So I'm going to give you that opportunity.
No problem. Thanks. Yes, I was just going to say something about negative reviews, which I do write. I don't always write. I think the most negative review I have ever written was of a really not very good novel by Salman Rushdie, and where the LRB, who write the headlines, gave it the headline, and the audience throws vegetables, and I threw a lot of vegetables. It seemed to be a sort of lazy, self-indulgent book, and I said so. And I wouldn't have done it for somebody, as you were saying, who was not Salman Rushdie, or of that sort of status, because it does seem to be important to say to people who are going to buy a book in bulk, yeah, this isn't a good one. Years ago, I also had a sort of niche role writing. I used to write pieces for the Evening Standard, the London Evening Standard, which used to have a big reviews section, and he regularly used to send me the latest book that argued that Shakespeare wasn't written by Shakespeare but by somebody else. And I have to say, it was the sort of easiest 500 quid I've ever earned in my life, because I just say, no, it was written by Shakespeare, and explain the more or less implausible arguments put forward by the unfortunate author that Shakespeare's plays were written by somebody else, and then give the rather more strong arguments for the plays having been written by Shakespeare. But after 3 or 4 of those, even when you're getting paid, it gets pretty dull. And now, if I get a book that I just don't think is weighty enough to think about seriously, I just say, no, I'm not going to do it.
Well, that sets up nicely this question I wanted to ask all of you. Everybody talked a little bit about this, but I think that it's useful probably for our audience as well to think about how we pick books, how both from the editor's point of view, how you pick what you're putting into the section, and also from a writer's point of view, how you pick what you may want to write about, particularly if you're pitching. I mean, I'll just say that I often pitch books that I know I want to read. And, you know, and I want to engage with them. I both want to engage with them at a deeper level than just simply sitting on the couch and reading them. I want to actually kind of, you know, be in conversation with them, but also I'm busy, so I almost want to require myself to read that book. You know, I want to read that book, so I'm going to look for an assignment to write about it, so that I won't be able to like put it aside at the end of the night, and you know, when I'm tired and not read it, I'll kind of be required to read it. I'm kind of building that structure in. I'm curious, both from the editorial point of view and the reviewer's side, how do you choose what you assign, or how do you choose what you pitch? I realize it's a broad question and there are a lot of different criteria that fit into that, but if anyone wants to jump in on that question, I'd love to hear what you all think.
I could jump in. I used to pick more broadly. I'd look through the pre-publication reviews and try to see, you know, if there was an author that interested me, or there was an idea that interested me, and follow that and pitch more broadly. But I think over the years, my ideas have become narrower, so that I'm really looking for something that I can be interested in. I don't see the point of spending time with a book, because I read a book twice, 3 times when I'm writing a review, and I don't see the point in doing that for a book that I can tell is not going to be for me. But I sometimes hate a book. I do write negative reviews, and I feel very guilty actually to write them, because I know what it's like to receive them. But I think you have to, and I think ultimately the hope is to get a lot of different reviews from different voices and different perspectives, so that you have a bigger conversation about the book, so that it can live. I don't think, you know, squelching negative reviews is the answer, but I also think, you know, the words are degraded at this point. So I really only want to pitch books that I'm passionate about one way or another. And when I've reviewed negatively, it's because I was assigned to the book and I thought it would be in my wheelhouse, and it wasn't. And I think that's what a lot of, you know, staff writers, they end up getting assigned books they didn't really want to read. And so you end up with something, I think, like the Dwight Garner Bewilderment. You know, Bewilderment is a huge book, and it's by a major author. And so it ended up with a reviewer. No matter what, it was going to end up with a reviewer at the New York Times, and then there was a negative review, but there were plenty of good reviews to balance it out, and different perspectives on, you know, Powers' work. So
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to take a shot at that? I'm curious about, I mean, actually, I want to direct this at the 2 editors. I'm curious about, let's stick with Powers for a moment, or Bewilderment. A book like that, I'm curious about sort of the sense of the need to cover the book, going back to what you were saying originally, Boris, of the review functioning as kind of journalism as well. So they need to cover certain books in the book as news category, however we want to define that territory. And for you, James, kind of sitting a little bit outside the ability to not have to cover the book as news. I'm wondering how those, Boris, maybe we can start with you. I'm wondering how that influences kind of what gets assigned for the section, and what might not, depending on space.
Yeah, I think it also allows me to go back and say that in terms of negative reviews, that I am definitely not interested in clubbing, you know, baby seals or otters, for that matter, to go back to the Dwight Garner review. Yeah, no, relevance matters to me and matters to our readers, and that's not necessarily newsiness, but it could be something, you know, we cover the West. It's kind of our job to cover the West, and so that means curating a slightly different list of book reviews than you would if you were on the East Coast, paying a little more attention, and particularly in interviews and profiles and things like that, to writers in the West. So, but you know, of course you want to chime in on the big books that are coming out, and when you do choose to cover something a little smaller, that you choose it generally because of enthusiasm, or because it sort of brings it's relevant to a conversation that's going on right now, or because the critic really has something to say. It doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes, you know, I'll run a book review and be like, did we really have to run that? I'm not sure. But you make your best guess. So yeah, that's the mix that I'm kind of going for.
Mm-hmm. James?
And yeah, just to sort of weigh in quickly there, you know, we don't do the newsier things typically, and I've worked in other places where that was absolutely the thing. And so it's, but sort of at the Believer, you know, it is kind of left up to some passion and a little bit, I have to admit, like subjectivity, for instance. So we're not running, you know, I had a pitch from a writer I like that was about, you know, the new Franzen. But I also, there's a pitch from a writer I didn't know about the new Joy Williams. And that one, you know, had a, I think, sharper angle. It was an angle about sort of, you know, kind of Gen Z activism and sort of kind of like oldster activism, and like how that, you know, sort of how she's kind of engaging with those ideas. And, you know, that, and that piece will run, but, you know, that was reviewed, both of those books were reviewed in Book Forum. So, you know, like in the latest issue. So, you know, and, you know, so it's a little bit of a whim. Also, it happened that I had read a lot more Joy Williams than Franzen, for, you know, what it's worth. So, you know, I think some of, as you know, some of this is like, there's no science to it. Also, it's just, I actually think I would like Crossroads a lot based on the review I read and talking to like Frank Wan about it. But so, yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the publisher, the publication.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's absolutely right. Danzy, I wanted to come back to you because you had said something that resonated for me and probably for many writers, which is the idea of writing reviews or writing the essay reviews because you can actually finish them. And I just, you know, I wanted to get at that notion, particularly if you're writing books of your own, which, as anyone who has done that knows, can be a just endless and frustrating process. The idea of putting it down for a couple of weeks and writing something self-contained that you can kind of finish and get out into the world can be quite powerful. And I wondered if you can talk a little bit about that, you know, just in terms of that, the way that sort of integrates reviewing or the critical or, you know, literary production, literary commentary stuff into your own practice and your own, you know, your own creative work.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it can just be a way of procrastinating from writing your novel. And that can be like, there's many ways to procrastinate. You can research, you can write a review, you can watch Real Housewives, whatever you know, there's so many ways to get out of writing your novel. But this one feels somehow more wholesome and like you have something to show for it later. But I think one of the things that's hard for me is, I'm trying to think how to put it, but the critic part of my brain is very different from the creative novelist part of my brain. And in some ways that critic portion of my brain is the one I want to kick out of the room while I'm trying to finish a creative work, because it's the one that's going to constrain this and tell me it's a piece of shit. And like, it's that critic voice that like isn't helpful with a first draft of a novel, because it's going to be messy and necessarily bad. So I think I'm careful about timing in terms of, you know, when I write a review, because I don't want to sort of invite those voices into my writing space at a sort of vulnerable moment in my writing process. And, you know, kind of going back to the question you asked a few questions ago about just being a writer and my relationship to reviews, you know, I'm also careful about how many reviews I read of my own work, and I don't want to read too much when I have a book come out. And I just was trying to find this quote, but and it's actually for me dangerous to read really good reviews, maybe more than to read really bad reviews of my work. And this is a quote from Hemingway. If you believe the critics when they say that your work is great, then you must believe them when they say that it is rotten, and you'll lose confidence. So for me, it's filtering, a lot of filtering with reviews. And I actually enjoy even sometimes reading negative reviews later, like years later, of my work if they're smart, when I've had some time to like cut the umbilical cord from the book and let it go into the world and is interesting, even if it's about your own work.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. Anita, I wonder, because you're also writing your own novels and short stories and publishing them, and then also and functioning as a critic. And I wonder if you can kind of comment on that sort of that relationship or that balance.
Yeah, I agree with Dancy. Actually, I think the critical function is, for me, completely separate from the creative function, and I do have to banish the critic, which is why I write fiction early in the morning, and I don't really let anything interfere with that space. There's at least one little carved out, this is just my imagination. I don't have to be critical about my own voice or censor myself or, whatever else. But the critical function is just completely different. And there are books that I think are really bad and, I will criticize them. And I think there is the tension there is social, right? So because the literary world is actually fairly small and the number of people who write books is pretty small. So the likelihood is I ended up at a party with, with someone that I had written something kind of mean, it was kind of mean, but it was really true. It wasn't a funny book. I said it wasn't a funny book. It probably hurt this person's ego very badly. And then I had to run around in the party to avoid this person because I didn't want them to be upset with me. And that person would never, I don't think that person would ever spit on me. Very nice person. But I spent a lot of time avoiding. And I think, that's the danger with social media and criticism is you interact with a lot of people online and you run into a lot of people. You then run into that small circuit of people at a party or something. And there is a tension there. And I think Pearl Sagal is really smart. She says she avoids the parties, but I like the parties. So it's a little bit of a problem, but you still have to be honest, as a critic. So I think any really true writer knows you have to be true to your own voice. I mean, the critic is writing from their own voice. Their name is what's going on it. When you name to an opinion, it has to be actually your opinion. So that's how I feel about it. And I don't avoid reviews of my work because you're supposed to promote now apparently, and you have to do that. But I do try to keep a filter or a block against the critical opinion of my work because it's usually irrelevant to me as an artist. So.
But the party problem is why I like to write about dead writers. You don't bump into them.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, the best or sort of my favorite reviews of my own work are in some perverse way are the reviews that critique the work for doing what I intended it to do, because at least I know that then it's doing what I wanted it to do. And that person, if it didn't speak to them, that's totally fine. But it wasn't like the work didn't, that I failed to achieve some objective or something like that. I do want to open it. I want to see if there are questions from the broader audience, because we have about 20 minutes left. I have some other questions, but I want to see what people have to ask. So Damien, you are up.
Yes, hello, excuse me. So I'm a first year PhD student at USC. And, I was the entertainment editor of my school papers in undergrad. And I've been fortunate enough to write a couple reviews for the Los Angeles Review of Books lately. But this is sort of new to me. And I'm curious when you're pitching, this is for the editors primarily. If I'm going to be pitching books that I want to review to editors, what is the sort of window in terms of like distance between publication date and, if I've been told that they're accepting pitches for January or February, are books that are being published in November and December ideal, or like how far away should that be?
I would say if it's a book that a lot of people know about, I'm going to probably lock it down much earlier. So not as early as I should, but maybe 5 or 6 months. But if you want to pitch something that's for November, that's probably fine. I've got some holes in there. I think a couple months out, but not any. I mean, you want to give yourself time to do it, and you don't want to be scrambling. So I would say between 2 and 6 months.
James?
Yeah, that's pretty sound. I mean, it depends on the publication. For us, I mean, yeah, but I mean, I would say, like, I would just speak to the larger landscape too of, I think, as I see it, is just like, if it's a January, February publication, if it's a big book, you like need to be pitching that months in advance, and then so that the piece will run right when it ideally like comes out. That's like the way I think the larger publications do it. And then, you know, a web place will be a little more nimble. They'll be able to run it with, I think, a little bit more with a shorter lead time. And then, yeah, and then I think it's, and it depends on how big the book is, though, too. If it's a smaller press, an independent press, you'll, I think, be able to, if you have a full-throated endorsement and you really know your stuff, you might be, you know, you can, I think, find a way in, even if it's a little less pegged.
As a follow-up to that, I just want to jump in and ask for the editors too. Is it, for a writer trying to break in, is it more useful for them to sort of look for a book that's maybe a little off the beaten track, maybe one you might not have noticed, not like, you know, let's say, you know, not one of the big books of fall, let's say, which might already have been assigned or that's on your radar? Is that an easier way to get your attention?
I mean, yeah, probably, because, you know, if this a writer that I haven't heard of is pitching Jonathan Franzen, I'm just going to say no. And then where do we go from that conversation? Because I don't have anything else to go on. So, yeah, I would say, you know, something that you're more passionate about than most people know about would be probably the sweet spot. Yeah.
Yeah. I've had success that way, I think, as a freelancer too. Also, I think it's something, it could be someone who's published a lot of things, but you just happen to have a really good perspective on it, and you can, you know, sort of articulate that.
This is also where I'd say, you know, I've spoken a lot about straight up book reviews, but we are also interested, of course, in essays that have personal angles and essays about larger themes. And I think that's, I'm glad you brought that up, because if you have a unique angle on a book or several books or a trend, especially something that makes you sort of sit up and say, well, I didn't notice that before, then I think you've got a good shot.
Other questions from people who are here? What else do you all want to know? As I say, I have a couple of questions of my own, which I'm happy to ask, but I just want to make sure there's space for other people. So I'll throw one out while we're waiting to see, and this is also for the panel in general. So I want to touch back on that N+1 essay a little bit, which I'm not sure if everyone read, but it was an essay about the state of reviewing. I'll reserve my own critique of the essay till we talk about it a little bit. But, you know, it occurred to me, and, you know, that we've been, you know, reading essays about the state of reviewing and the state of critical culture since at least, you know, I mean, that famous Elizabeth Hardwick essay in Harper's, which ran before I'm sure before anybody on this panel was even born, in 1958. So I'm curious what everybody thinks the state of reviewing, or let's say critical culture or literary conversation is, because it seems to me that that's one of the key elements of what we're talking about. Does it feel as dire to all of you as that N+1 piece sort of hinted that it was? And here I will tip my hand by saying that I thought there was a lot of that. There were so many straw arguments in that piece that it was difficult to sort of know quite what, and generalities. It was difficult to kind of put your feet down as a reader, I felt. But what's your take on the kind of state of critical culture or literary conversation? I'm curious just generally what people think.
I mean, I'm curious about other people's thoughts on it, because I feel like as a writer, and I'm not on social media, but obviously it kind of through the vapors comes to me, and like, you've sort of never had so many people offering up their strong opinions on work when you publish now, and in a culture of like trolling and people just, you know, trying to get as many followers by being extreme, and then the book review sort of in a more classical form has, more space, and you have to do some more work than the little quips. But I'm just wondering, like, if there's if you all see how that has influenced the book review or the culture of Twitter, and like sort of everyone is a book reviewer now. I guess that was bouncing off your question, David.
Yeah, I think I'm really curious about that. Yeah.
I'm loath to blame the numbers, because the numbers just reveal what we already knew in many cases. But the numbers say that people don't read book reviews very often. And that's a reality that I have to deal with every day. But I'm not sure if it's different than it was 10 or 20 years ago. I just think that the overlords are paying more attention, whether they're billionaire owners or hedge funds that are destroying newspapers. And it's a real problem, but I don't think it's necessarily that the culture is broken in some fundamental way. I just think it's a problem of sustaining businesses that are counting their pennies much more closely than they used to.
Well, and that also have digital, have the technology to literally track how many eyes are landing on a piece of writing, which was never the case prior to the internet.
Exactly. Yeah.
Other thoughts? Oh yeah, Colin, go ahead. Sorry.
No. I think it depends a lot on where you are and what kind of books we're talking about. I mean, certainly it's true in the UK that simply the volume of book reviews in national daily newspapers has diminished drastically in the past 20 years. I think it's also true that the range has shrunk. So one thing I did a little while ago was I had to do a dictionary literary biography entry for my mum, who wrote children's books. And one of the requirements of doing that piece was that I should talk about early reviews. So I went back to the 1980s and 1970s in the Times Literary Supplement, where they had really substantial half-page reviews, really thoughtful reviews of children's books. They simply don't do that anymore. And so there are little pockets, I think, where reviewing has really broken. And I think there is certainly in this country, a general diminution. I don't think there's been a diminution in quality. I think it's more about range. And I think that goes along with a much harder market for books generally. And I don't think any one factor can be blamed for it, or any particular individual. It's just the way things are. But I do feel that there is more room probably for online substantial reviews of what are now relatively neglected areas like children's fiction, where the big sellers get a lot of publicity and the rest don't get any.
Yeah, I think that's I think there was more range, but which I think has to do with the fact that there were more pages, there was more space. Although there is now digital space as opposed to print space. James, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts of this, again, from coming sort of from outside of the newspaper territory. Your concerns are somewhat different in terms of how you're putting together a review package or a set of reviews, or thinking about your coverage over the course of a couple of issues. What's your sense of the state of things?
I started looking. So there's been this, probably some of y'all, maybe all of y'all have seen the interesting Twitter thread by the New Yorker archivist Erin Overby. And essentially it's a, she's been compiling a lot of data from her role as an archivist. And, for instance, essentially it's about how not undiverse the New Yorker print mag especially has been. And, there was a really circulated tweet that, she says, like, 96 years of existence, print mag has published only 4 book reviews by African-American women, which is less than 0.01%. And you know, in the last 30 years, 3.6% of the book reviews in the New Yorker mag were published by Black critics or writers. And she goes on to sort of, there's sort of stats for many different groups and different marginalized groups. And I mean, I guess I find this very fascinating because I think, I don't know, I do actually, I feel like, you know, it's not the be all end all, like we're going to see what, but I'm so curious to see how this plays out, right? Because one of the things that was interesting, I think, was seeing that I actually, when I saw it, I know Erin not super well, but, you know, I had interned in the New Yorker 20 years ago or something, you know, almost. And I just remember, I thought, oh, Erin is no longer at the New Yorker. And when I saw it, and it turns out, no, she is. And I'm so curious to see like how that will play out, you know, is it going to lead to sort of big structural changes at that magazine, at other magazines? It started a lot of Twitter conversations, or is it going to lead to something sadder, you know, a sort of squashing of a you know, someone who's, you know, just sort of presenting some information that, if read in an uncharitable light, is incendiary or subversive, you know, there. And so I think it's a story that I'm very interested in. I think that's kind of ongoing. And I think, you know, it's something, right, obviously not just at the New Yorker, but across, I think, our industry, sort of how we kind of address these larger or these sort of long ignored or under, you know, publicly ignored. I think some folks have been very aware of it since the beginning of it and not feeling seen or having a footing somewhere. And I think, you know, is it going to be actually like like real change, or is it going to be something that's very kind of a papering over, or if, you know, when the stakes rise and the sort of when they're speaking out, like what's going to happen, is a place going to, you know, do sort of become vindictive and even, you know, sort of seek to silence the voices. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at, even larger than just putting together a package, I think, for me.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of sort of when the first Vita accounts started coming out, and things that were essentially hiding in plain sight were no longer hiding in plain sight any longer, but were documented, and there were statistics to support it. There was a hand up that went down, so I don't want to call on the person, but I do want to say, if you want to raise your hand, we will call on you. Daniela, you have your hand up.
Yeah, this has been fascinating, and you know, Dancy brought this up about reviewing as a way of bringing, you know, shedding light on figures that have been obscured or haven't received it. And part of what is so interesting about this conversation is that the world of writing is, of course, universal, but of reviewing is extremely local. And just as even in this conversation, we can see that there's differences about how reviewing works in England versus the US. We're talking exclusively about Anglophone contexts and about Anglophone reviewing. And I was just thinking, when I read the newspaper, the music, the art museum exhibitions, the plays that are reviewed are both those that are local to the city where I live or the city where the newspaper publishes, but also that take place elsewhere. And the readers will never see them, but there is a sense that you have to read, that is interesting, that is worth reading about music you will never hear performed, or a museum exhibition you will never be able to see. But no reviews will be published of books that are not printed in English. And so, not that I am saying, you know, that would be a fun one for you editors. Would you ever publish reviews of books that your readers will not read? But I've been thinking a lot about sort of the dominance of English and what that means for other literatures, especially as we start seeing writers who originally write in other languages, their English translations of their books get nominated for English language prizes, and then they start writing in English. And so the effects of that. So I just wanted to sort of bring in this question even more broadly, when the voices that are not heard are because of the dominance of one language in a world that is plurilingual and connected. Boris, you unmuted yourself.
Yes, just because I can brag about having run a story about a book that has not been translated into English. A Mexican writer, sort of a seminal gay Mexican writer, died a few months ago. And I can't take credit for this. It was pitched by Daniel Hernandez, who's a great writer, who was our Mexico City correspondent for a while. And he wrote this sort of, it was a little bit late to run as an obit, but it was more of a, when are we going to see a good translation of his books? So yeah, we want to do that. And we have bilingual writers represented among our reviews. Sometimes they'll do bilingual editions simultaneously. And we have on Espanol, LA Times on Espanol, which covers Spanish language books. But if somebody pitched me a story about a book that hasn't been translated yet and they were excited about it, I would definitely be interested.
I think so. I just think Alejandro Zambra, the Chilean writer, is a really interesting example of someone who has written a lot. I love his work. Not to Read is a great collection of essays that talks about a lot of works that haven't been published yet in English. And I read that voraciously. I loved it. And have worked with Alejandro, been sort of lucky enough to work with him on pieces at the Lever. But it's, because our resources are so limited, I think, we didn't commission him to write about someone who was not translated yet, but we did run a piece about, that he had written about something that was an object, and also about his own work. So it was like a little bit of a middle ground, but I guess I can say I'm happy to say that most recently the sort of coda to this is just, there was a writer, Mario Lavero, who is a Uruguayan writer, and he had a book that was recently translated in English, but I had heard about him through the Zambra essays. So we're, it was like that the Zambra essays about stuff that wasn't yet in English had at least seeded this other work that we could move very quickly and excitedly about with a lot of enthusiasm. And so, I think it is, it's a slow process, but there's light, I guess, some light, some hope, flicker.
That's I think that's a great way to end this conversation, with that idea of some hope or some light. We are out of time, so I want to thank all of the panelists for being here in the first place, and for their these really interesting comments and participation. Colin Burrow, Anita Felicelli, Boris Kochka, Dancy, Senna, James Ye. And I want to thank all of you for coming, and thank the Levan Institute for hosting this. We will be back next month with the second On Writing event about writing the essay, the art of writing the essay. And if you want to revisit this, this will be archived. The video of this will be archived on the Levan Institute site. Thanks to all of you. Have a good rest of your day, and be safe. Thank you.
Thank you.